Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Metamodern Spirituality podcast. I've been on hiatus for a little bit for the past few months, but I'm really excited to return to conversations that matter with some fascinating people, and excited to begin the next sort of iteration of the podcast with no less a figure and thinker as Jason Ānanda Josephson Storm, who is the author of this book, Metamodernism. I guess they made more than one. Metamodernism, The Future of Theory. I'm glad that they did, because it's an important book. Yeah, just a little blurb about Jason here. Jason is a historian, philosopher, professor of religion, and chair of science and technology studies at Williams College. He received his PhD from Stanford University and his MA from Harvard. He has three primary areas of research: Japanese religions, European intellectual history, and theory. The common thread is an attempt to decenter received narratives in the study of religion and science, which I'm sure we'll get into. Storm is the author of The Invention of Religion in Japan, The Myth of Disenchantment, and the book we'll be primarily discussing today, Metamodernism, The Future of Theory. I also had the privilege of co-presenting with Jason, along with Linda Ciariello and some others, at the 2021 American Academy of Religion annual conference, in a panel that we put on called Metamodernism, Emerging Theorizations for Studying Culture and Religion Beyond Postmodernism. And that was fun. For today, I'm just excited to dig into this book, which, again, I say is really rich and important, and have some questions that I'd love to ask you, and some material I'd love to cover. So anyway, but thanks so much, Jason, for being on the podcast.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. Good to see you again. And this will be fun. Yeah, and we can split it into two parts if we go into enough detail that we can't cover it in one day, or not, as depending on everybody's attention span and energy levels and what have you.
Sure. Yeah. Well, yeah, because I mean, there's a lot in this book. So yeah, depending on how much we're able to get into all that, we could potentially extend this. I could see this very easily turning into, a continued conversation, or a series even. But let's start with just contextualize this a little bit. One of the things I wanted to begin with here is metamodernism is a term that is now at this point kind of used in a couple of different discursive scenes, or something, however you want to say. It's there's at least two kind of broad camps, as I've identified them. There's sort of the one out of cultural studies, which was popularized initially and with the seminal article from Tim Vermeulen and Robin van Doneker in 2010 called Notes on Metamodernism. And that kind of kickstarted this sort of, cultural studies, cultural theory approach to looking at culture after postmodernism, and trying to sort of develop a rubric for, stuff coming out of the art scene, et cetera. And then in 2017, Hansi Freinacht publishes this book, The Listening Society, kind of picks up that paradigm and expands it into a political agenda, but also mixes in a bunch of developmental theory, and has this sort of almost Hegelian kind of dialectical view of history in a multi-volume series. And so these have been multiple communities discussing metamodernism. There's been a lot of overlap, but there's also been sort of different conversations playing out in academia and in the sort of online scene, et cetera. So I'd be curious, contextualize this work, Metamodernism, The Future of Theory, within what a lot of people, who watch this podcast are already familiar with, which are those other forms of metamodernism. How does it relate? How does it differ? What's the relationship?
Yeah, sure. Great question. So I actually came to the term metamodernism from neither of those two sets of sources, but actually it was reading the writings of this Nigerian art historian, Moyo Okadiji. And for me, so to take a step back, for most of the history of this book, the working title was Absolute Disruption, The Future of Theory. And when it went out originally for peer review, it was under that title. And the peer reviewers were like, dude, what kind of movement are you part of? What kind of ism are you part of? And one of the peer reviewers was assumed that I was part of a movement called postmodernism, which is a really odious double redundant posts, and it was kind of terrible. And so my editor sort of encouraged me to think about what movement I was connected to in one way or another. And I thought back on this term metamodernism, which I'd encountered in Okadiji's work. And then I thought, I was having conversations with some other folk probably who may have been part of the art scene conversation around the term. And what struck me was that Okadiji describes metamodern artists, in which he includes himself in this more broadly, but artists who are trying to sort of work through both modernism and postmodernism, both as a kind of intentional project move. And he describes metamodernism, and I was lucky enough to be able to interview him recently for a journal, as a kind of what I would call a decolonial term in his usage. He's looking for something, for a position that fits outside or that wasn't fully captured by the normal periodizations of, pre-modern, modern, postmodern, etc. And I really resonated with that in terms of his work. And I was aware when I shifted to use that term, I became aware of the work by Vermeulen and Freinacht and others. And I'll say, my work bears the most similarity to folks who are trying to produce rather than describe metamodernism. What I'm not mostly doing is looking for things in mainstream culture and saying that's metamodern, that's not metamodern. I'm not trying to describe an already existing category, movement, or so-called structure, feeling, or anything like that. And in fact, I have some reservations about the way that grand periodization works. Part of the book before this one was a critique of the idea of modernity. So I'm not so into this periodization that goes pre-modernity, modernity, post-modernity, metamodernity. But what I do share with a lot of folks using the term metamodernism is a desire to work through and past both modernism, but especially postmodernism, and a way to work past postmodernism, which is not a denial of it, not a return to some idealized, enlightenment or positivism or what have you. There's a lot of people who want to argue against postmodernism by basically just trumpeting some imaginary neo-enlightenment, and I don't want to do that. And so in that respect, I think my work has resonances with people like the quote-unquote Hansi Freinacht duo and their project to produce a particular politics, although my project is also different quite in its particulars, and it has resonance with artists who are trying to produce metamodern art, whether that's literature. In certain ways, I see some of the stuff that I've seen of yours as producing kind of metamodern literature or spiritual formations, but it has less in common with the folks who are just trying to describe metamodern phenomena. Yeah. Although you're welcome to try and describe me or fit me into that camp. Those listeners who are fans of that version of it. I have a special problem with oscillation theories as well, but I'll bracket that for the moment.
Well, one of the things that was so fascinating to me about reading this book was that a common image that gets brought up, and it might be more than an image, in metamodern circles that I'm conversing in, is this idea of the attractor, right? That there seems to be something that is kind of coming online. And this comes from complex systems theory, right? Where Lorentz attractors and things that there's a sort of a shift towards something new that's coming on the scene, and people seem to be intuiting it or relating to it independently and kind of finding each other and being like, oh, okay, we're starting to develop a vocabulary and a sort of lexicon around this sort of thing. And what I found very fascinating about your book was that even though I think you're largely coming at metamodernism in a very adjacent way, it's complementary, right? But it's complementary. Yeah. It's sort of independently coming to very similar sorts of frameworks and ways of thinking and ideas, even though it's its own sort of track, and it sort of dovetails. But it's almost like at this point there's sort of three legs of this stool. There's the cultural theory people, there's the Hansi developmental theory, and then there's this philosophical sort of program that you've laid out in this book, and they all seem to kind of co-inform one another in very fascinating ways, I think, but while also remaining distinct.
Totally. And and I like what the conversations I've had with folks, especially since the book has come out, who are doing other metamodernisms, has all been appealing. It's been a good crowd to kind of chat with and talk to, even if we're doing very different things in certain ways, or complementary but different things.
Yeah. Now, but you brought something up that I wanted to talk about. So you mentioned that you have a sort of problem with this periodization approach. And you talk about that in the book. And I found that was very fascinating, because on the one hand, you sort of start the book out and you're like, I have this problem with like postmodernism as a thing. And yet a lot of your book is framed as here's what we can come after postmodernism in a sense, right? So I wanted to get a better understanding of how you can do that simultaneously. How can you be like sort of critiquing the very category and yet simultaneously being like, and here's a form of, you know, what comes after this thing that supposedly doesn't exist in quite the same way that people think about.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great. So there are so two things that are going on here. First, there's a resistance to the broad periodization. So, and part of that comes out of my critique of the category of modernity. So to take a step back on that one, your listeners may or may not know, but the term modern arguably dates from 580. Cassiodorus, the Roman senator turned Christian monk, who first coined this term modernus to describe, you know, that's that which is modern, or of the, well, that which is of the current moment. So the term, you know, has this long history now, you know, more than 1,000-year-old history of different attempts to describe nowness. Okay. And he already started using it as a contrastive category to tradition. So it's tradition versus modern, et cetera, in that early formulation. But then the problem is that term modern tends to hide a bunch of different kinds of processes, which are very different. The things that Cassiodorus would have thought were, you know, was modern, have, you know, probably no, you know, most people today would describe as medieval or maybe even pre-medieval. I mean, you know, sometimes people have in mind industrialization or globalization or literacy or different kinds of artistic or philosophical movements. And the thing is that the word modern is too expansive for that, and it mostly signals a rupture, as though that there was a break. At a certain moment, it became now. And I don't want to recap the whole argument of the second book, but I'll just say that I'm skeptical of most of those kinds of ruptures. So I don't think that there was a moment where we suddenly became modern. So to borrow a phrase from Bruno Latour, you know, we were never modern in some specific way. And so a lot of times postmodernity is described as a second rupture after modernity. And that I think is incoherent. And also when postmodernity gets transposed into philosophy, there's a tendency not only to describe it as a periodizing rupture, but also to deploy certain thinkers who get named postmodern thinkers. And one of the weird things is that there's an overlap between the canon of modernism in philosophy and postmodernism in philosophy. So, for instance, Nietzsche was a paradigmatic modern figure before he became a paradigmatic postmodern figure. So it's an opposition built in rhetorically in the term postmodernism between itself and a period that it claims to have transcended, but it's an opposition it can't really sustain. And so that said, so I'm not into postmodern, and I also think that I'm also suspicious of zeitgeist moves that tend to assume that a certain era has one texture to it, that there is a geist, a spirit of a particular era that applies everywhere. And there are good sort of post-colonial theoretical reasons to think that people get left out of those stories. The people who don't fit, who don't seem quintessentially modern because they were poor and black, or because they were not living in Europe or America, or because, you know, well, all these different groups that fall out of those narratives. So all that means to say, I think broad zeitgeists are probably not accurate descriptors, and even Foucault's notion of episteme, broad, but also problematic for a different set of reasons. But basically, there's something there, but not as much there as Foucault would like to suggest. That said, there are movements that get called either by their proponents or their enemies certain names. And so the movement that I was interested in that got called postmodernism was a concrete movement. And its claim to capture the spirit of a times we might render problematic, but it was, insofar as it was anthologized, a coalition of different philosophers and sometimes artists and different literary figures into a certain kind of a canon. And that canon shaped a lot of the way that not only scholars, but, you know, educators and artists approached fundamental issues like the nature of language, or questions about skepticism, or, you know, questions about what the reality is, all those things. So that particular canonized form of postmodernism, what we could call postmodernism as paradigm, that's what I'm trying to track, you know, and trying to overcome or work through and out the other side of. Not that I think that it was all, can I cuss on your podcast? Is that okay?
By all means.
Okay. Not that I think postmodernism is all bullshit. I think that there's some really interesting stuff there, but it's something that has already started producing diminishing returns. And it has done so, you know, since I started graduate school, you know, like postmodernism had its massive, big influence in the 1990s, and has been in a way paying off diminishing returns from then on, basically. Yeah. And so in that respect, the postmodernism that I'm trying to work out of or attack or critique is not a grand period or even a grand zeitgeist of culture forms, but rather an attempt to work through a particular philosophical constellation or set of constellations.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the only, I could keep going into more detail.
No, that's really helpful. I appreciate that. I found multiple attempts to theorize postmodernism and these sorts of paradigms in different ways. I discovered the Vermeulen von Daniker way first, and of course they're drawing on it, their own kind of set of literature, and Raymond Williams and Jameson, that sort of a thing. And then I discovered after that the Hanzi way, and I actually found that opened up. It helped resolve a lot of the questions or the issues that I think the very important problems that you're raising around periodization. And that would be its own fascinating conversation that I think we could get into. Would be a lot of fun, but okay, but for the purposes of our current conversation, that helps at least kind of situate exactly what this sort of thing is. So I appreciate that. Well, then what I'd like to do is sort of work a little bit through this book. Again, I don't think we'll be able, I don't know how far we can get because it's very rich and there's a lot here. But I'll just kind of set up a couple questions as the book brings up certain sets of material and throw them by you, and would love to hear you kind of unpack them and suggest what they're about. And in some ways, maybe the first way of doing that would be to get at something you just raised, which is that postmodernism as that sort of paradigm that you're talking about had its own set of sort of rhetorical and theoretical strategies that it would use to kind of analyze and interpret things. And you do a brilliant job, I think, in this book, sort of presenting this sort of rubric of deconstruction of like, this is how you go about deconstructing a thing. And I think that was both very helpful because once you kind of lay it out in this sort of stepwise, process, you can see very clearly like, okay, then this is sort of a transferable rubric that you can start to identify going on all over the place. And once you have that as an object, you can begin to theorize about that, etc. But so maybe talk a little bit first about this rubric of like, applying the deconstructionist lens and what you're trying to do in the book by sort of laying out this sort of like, deconstruction 101 approach and what that kind of affords us once we get our heads around that.
Yeah. So the first thing that I think people will want to know about the postmodernism that I identify in the book is that it was produced in a kind of pastiche bricolage way from different theorists. So there's no single theorist that turns out to be the postmodern theorist. What actually happened was people often in the Anglo-American Academy took some bits of Derrida and some bits of Foucault and some bits of, Heidegger or whoever, added that together and ended up producing a model. And there are literally anthologies that were called, postmodernism in literature, or postmodernism for, I don't know if they had one called For Dummies, but they might as well have, that kind of thing, right? And so out of that, you can abstract a set of common patterns or techniques. And these were things that, to be clear, some scholars, adopted and used as positive models, and some scholars, this was the antithetical tradition against which some kind of other version of theory was supposed to stage itself. So often postmodernism was a critical category. Like those guys are postmodernists, or especially like terms like anti-realists. It's like often it's like the other guys who are the anti-realists or whatever, but not as many people call themselves anti-realists or what have you. So one of those, so I end up like breaking postmodernism down into 5 different areas, and there are particular reasons for this, but basically 5 different important philosophical concerns that people found when they turned to postmodernism as a model. Like, what were they looking for? Why did they need a model at all? And part of it is that as scholars, we're often trying to figure out some basic things, and not just, scholars, educators, human beings, stuff about, as I was saying, language in the world or what have you. But a lot of the deconstructive techniques that I talk about, and now we're in basically the second chapter here, were questions about the nature of concepts. So one of the things that started to happen, and this happened even before this material was anthologized under the heading postmodernism, was that starting roughly in the early to mid 1950s, an older notion of concepts started to break down. And the key figure in this critique is probably Ludwig Wittgenstein, and the later Wittgenstein's, if for those of you listeners who might be familiar with Wittgenstein's philosophy, he said he had a set of lecture notes that were mostly unpublished during his life. He kind of repudiated the work that he had done as a younger man, or at least that's one reading. And famously out of this, he began to worry about what it is that binds concepts together. Concepts like the word, let's say, game. Like, what is it that all games share? And if you think about that, you might think, well, what is it that makes a card game like chess, like soccer, like football, like a video game? And Wittgenstein says at best, the only thing there is a kind of tissue of family resemblance. Basically, I'm simplifying quite a bit here, but basically he says that. Around that period in the 1950s, before that, the idea is that you could get to concepts, the things that we study, through necessary and sufficient condition definitions. There's a long legacy of this all the way back to Aristotle, but there's a long medieval scholastic tradition that kind of really solidified this. And even thinkers like Descartes thought that you could just, if you could make your ideas clear enough, you could do this kind of work. And it turns out that shit is impossible to define. Like we have not come up with a good definition of anything. Like if you look at even something as basic as the word chair, it's problematic to define because definitions tend to either include too much or exclude too much, or they tend to have basically inherent problems built into them. And so this became clear to a lot of people in the 1950s, and to some people in the 1950s, and then it began to expand outward, and then developed a new canon that was sort of back projected in the 70s that then connected up to people like Derrida and Saussure and others. But the original problem was with Wittgenstein in the 50s. Okay. So with that historical context in mind, if you start to look at academic disciplines like, and I'm sorry, but when I get excited, I talk too quickly. So
I love it. Keep going. You're on a roll. I love it. It's great.
So a lot of academic disciplines from the 50s to the present have had these crises around their disciplinary objects. The two that I was originally trained to deal with were the category religion in religious studies, where we started thinking, that the category religion was itself fundamentally flawed for a certain set of reasons, and the category of science among some sub-school of philosophy of science associated with people like Kuhn and Feyerabend and others also began criticizing science in similar ways. But it turned out, after I did a bit of archival work on this, a whole raft of disciplines had attacked these categories. So in art historical circles, the category of art, in political science, to a lesser extent, the category of politics, in sociology, the category of society, in anthropology, culture, in English departments, literature, and on and on and on and on and on. And the first one that I identified in working out these moves in elaborate detail was in philosophy of art. And a famous thinker by the name of Moritz Weitz, who by coincidence my mother knows for some reason, but anyway, I'll leave the family stuff out of there. But basically, he started arguing that using Wittgenstein as a source, that you can't define art. And not only that, all attempts to define art run into problems. One of the obvious problems is as soon as you define art in one way, artists will do something that violates that definition of art. And, he has a story that goes back to Dada, but we'll forget that for a moment. But it turns out that there's no good way to define art. And it turns out that the place of art in, let's say, the European historical imaginary doesn't have a lot of correspondences in other cultures, et cetera. So people might paint in other cultures, but they often don't cluster the fine arts together. The idea that like painting and dance and sculpture share something that they don't share with leatherworking or, I don't know, making shirts or something, like that's weird. The art craft distinction or whatever, that turns out to be an idiosyncrasy of European history in the period that we often call the Renaissance, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what happened? So anyway, so all that is to say that if you take all these different critiques, you can start to add them together. If you take the critique of politics, if you take the critique of science, in an early draft of this book, in the Metamodernism book, like I just had chapter after chapter on the different critiques, but they actually turned out that they're often using very, very similar strategies, that the critiques are not as different as their different subjects might lead you to believe, and the fact that the scholars were mostly doing them in unawares of each other. So, scholars in art history were criticizing the category of art and often saying, defaulting into the term culture, saying art is just culture, in the same moment that anthropologists were like, actually, no, culture is a mess and we shouldn't use that term or whatever, right? So often they were independent. And then it turns out that you can abstract from them. And I come up with a list in the book. I call it the sort of an anarchist cookbook of attempts to destroy concepts, basically. And let's see. So, but basically there are a range of them and they're predictable, but you can make a kind of nominalist critique. You can show how the category has a bunch of sub things that don't adequately fall under it. You can note that a category is ethically loaded. You can make an ethical critique. That to call something art is often to praise it. If I point at a picture and say that's not art, often what I'm doing is criticizing it. That there's ethic, or there's norms built into what gets counted as art and what doesn't. we might say that there are often oppositions built into the categories that the category can't sustain. So the art craft distinction. We might also note that there tend to be problems of translation. So often scholars will come up with the phrase culture X has no version of the idea of art, or whatever, you might suggest. You could also do a kind of, so that's a sort of a culturally relativizing critique, or you can do a historical relativizing critique. You could say, in ancient Greece, they had no idea of the art, of fine art, or something like that. All of these kind of strategies are more or less available to most of the categories that people use to talk and think through. I haven't been able from memory to list all my different strategies, but those are the kind of things that I talk about in the book. And it turns out that if you add them together, you get kind of the model that many of us were taught in graduate school for how you knock down or quote unquote deconstruct pretty much anything that you might want to deconstruct. You track also the winners and losers. So you look at how systems of power are put in place, and you can see how, for instance, the forming of the category art had a lot to do, fine art had a lot to do with the history of European colonialism, or had a lot to do with the denigration of craft, and it had class dynamics built into it. And you could argue might have gender dynamics built into it, et cetera. There are a lot of different things that you could identify. And then if you highlight those, and then you can quote unquote deconstruct the category, and that there were a ton of books that basically were just doing that. And they often terminated in the deconstruction. Why there is no such thing as art, for instance, or whatever. The invention of blah, blah, the invention of religion in Japan, like my first book, or whatever, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. And no, that's exactly. And I think, now correct me if I'm wrong, but where you sort of go with this is that if there is a particular way that all these concepts seem to be deconstructed, that are all in some way sort of independently going on at the same time, that is sort of in some ways pointing us to something deeper that's going on, even as these things are simultaneously being sort of eroded according to a logic. It's like the logic that is causing the erosion itself is sort of insinuating something. Like on page 84, you write, if every category is different, the main thing they seem to share is that they can all be challenged in an analogous manner. The concepts in the human sciences fractured in similar ways because they are in some significant sense similar concepts. If this is the case, a new understanding of concepts and even knowledge can be built, not on a defense of the categories, but from the structure of the critique themselves. Is that sort of can you speak? Is that sort of this method that you seem to be employing here? Is that by using the very sort of kind of synthetic, and by that I mean like the synthesis of the sort of net sum of deconstructive strategies, they seem to be gesturing towards a thing that we can kind of actually wrap our heads around, and then that reveals something about reality? Is that kind of what you're doing here?
Yeah, what I ended up saying is that, and I'll use this sort of intentionally empty term to talk about these categories, but let's say social kinds. If it turns out that social kinds can all be deconstructed, again, I'm using deconstruction as a non-technical term, but if it turns out social kinds can all be deconstructed in the same way, that tells us something very fundamental about social kinds. And in fact, it functions as a new observation, especially insofar as scholars in the past who have done this deconstructive work have often thought that means you can't study these things at all. But if they're all deconstructible in the same way, that means that they all share things in common. Exactly. And so one of the stepping off points from the book, and this was true really from a very early phase of the book, is that, and this is why even the original title of Absolute Disruption was there. Hegel has a phrase, it is an absolute disruption that the spirit comes to find itself, something like that. But basically, so when everything has been torn apart and dismembered, you can figure out how to make progress, basically. In this case, I wanted to argue that it tells us something really fundamental about how social kinds are produced and maintained, and even what they are, by sort of like taking the negative spaces, taking the demolition work, and going from there, instead of trying to rebuild the objects or deny the demolition, or merely to just terminate in demolition. We don't just blow shit up. We then discover that because everything has similar kinds of fissures in it, that it all has similar kind of property, at least it's prone to certain kinds of.
It's almost like it's kind of like what they're doing at CERN. You crash things together, and out of the parts you can you're able to reconstruct something that it was never really there until it blew apart, or something. That's my own kind of metaphor.
Yeah, no, I like that. Yeah, it's like exactly. Once we've smash the particles together. You can see what they were made of to begin with. Sure.
I guess one last question before building off of this and going into the next thing would be, is that kind of where this metamodernism comes from? Is that we're deconstructing deconstruction, that we're doing an anti-foundationalist foundationalism, et cetera, et cetera? Is that the essence of the meta, or is that something different?
That's part of it. So I think one of the things that I was trying to do in this book, and there are a couple different reasons why that prefix meta appealed to me. Literally, it has the similar. It's just the Greek to the Latin post or whatever, but but it has this extra usage of over and above, or kind of a recursive or reflexive quality to it. And in that respect, part of what this book is it's one level removed scholarship about scholarship, right? So it is self-consciously recursive, because often what I'm trying to do is turn theories on themselves. So there's a difference between, I would argue, vicious and virtuous circles. If a vicious circle, if you turn something on itself in a vicious circle, it breaks down. Certain other things are virtuous circles. If you turn them on themselves, if you apply them to themselves, they explain or legitimate or help themselves work forward. The Metamodernism as a project, as I articulated in this, as a name for this particular philosophical project, is intended to be turned on itself in ways that are a virtuous circle. But I'm also very aware of this ability, this attempt to kind of move one level up and to look at things at this level of higher order abstraction. And so one of those moves is around the concepts, the social kinds, basically the deconstruction of the concept, and out the other side toward this new attempt to do a kind of social science of deconstructed concepts. But and you're right in giving me some other examples of my rhetorical formulations. I think that this is a move that you can do more generally. And so at several points in the book, I do, I argue for a skepticism towards skepticism, or think about anti-foundationalist foundations, etc. All of those are kinds of ways of doing a kind of move. And it's a move that I, broadly speaking, get from Hegel. Insofar as I have a particular reading of Hegel's negation of the negation that describes a little bit about what these moves should look like, but I'm not arguing for them on Hegel's authority. And one of the things I want to make clear, in case there are some viewers here who are not as interested in terms like postmodernism or fancy, or dead Germans like Hegel, I think that the end result stands on its own. So it doesn't matter, even if postmodernism had never existed, the things that then I'm arguing for, I think have their own evidence behind them. So it's also one of the things that I became particularly skeptical of, is all of this ventriloquistic argument from authority. So a lot of people think that the main way that you do theory is you find a bunch of dudes who are dead, who are famous, and you sock puppet them until you get them to say whatever it is that you already have decided is the case, maybe. So you're like, oh, here's Derrida talking about meaning, and then here's, Baldwin talking about meaning, and here's Hegel, and then you add them together, and then, at the very end of the conclusion, voila, here's some new weird hybrid thing that tells you neither anything about the main thinkers, nor necessarily about the final product, unless you treat these three figures as authorities. That's not what I want to do. And in fact, I do try and keep name dropping to a minimum. I mention names as sort of positional statements, so that people who are reading it, who are want to know what my influences are, or whatever, want a little bit of more clarification, can figure out what that is. But the end product stands on its own. So even if the Moritz Weitz had never lived and deconstructed art in the way that he had, I think that the generalizations that I make in this book about social kinds and how they're put together and how they function, I think that there's a lot of evidence of that coming from a lot of different places. Yeah. So again, it's kind of it's an argument. It's not an argument from authority, basically, or from ventriloquism. Yeah, but it's a meta argument. It's a higher level argument, and it's a higher level argument that in and of itself treats itself as its own object. So, in that respect, metamodernism as a social kind obeys the kind of critiques of social kinds that I talk about, etc.
Well, that's funny, actually. I maybe at the end we can kind of do that recursive move, come back to all this, and see how this all applies to what you're doing. That was one thing I considered that might be interesting to do. I also wanted just to observe that. Well, apart from naming, again, the sort of idea of the attractor, that, whether or not any particular historical contingent person had said a particular thing, that there are these sets of ideas that sort of do obey a certain kind of dialectical logic that, however you want to theorize that and think about it, that it seems to lend some significance to the ideas. This all becomes very recursive immediately, because then, all this is itself very contingent, or potentially contingent, in the sense we can start deconstructing Hegel and dialectics and all this stuff. But I don't want to do that. What I wanted to just point out is that that one of the things that I think does unite the attractor of the sort of postmodernism as it's been articulated by the cultural studies people, by the Hansi people, et cetera, and by your work, is that there's a concerted effort to not recoil from postmodern critique and sort of become anti-postmodern, but to use the very logic of postmodern critique to somehow get to something new on the other side of it by means of its own logic kind of unfolding, if that makes sense. And I think that your book does a great job doing that. In some ways, it's sort of the most robust version of that, of like, okay, you follow these things really to their end, and then you get this new thing, and then that's sort of what this metamodern postmodern approach is. That's sort of my take. But
and I like that, because I like that formulation in part because it's one way of noting how the three groups that you've just talked about are different than some other anti-postmodernisms. And, just because if you're clear, people have been declaring postmodernism dead, since at the same moment it was at its peak, since the 90s, basically. And there have been, not just the neo-enlighteners, but a whole raft of other putative successor movements to postmodernism, but often they work by resisting it rather than, or they work by formulating them, defining themselves against it, but not really reckoning with it. So one of the strategies that I find the most obnoxious, and I find it obnoxious because it persists to the present day, is the move that tries to just laugh postmodernism out of the room and just say, oh, that was just a bunch of junk and it was just obscurantists and it was no good. Ha 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 ha. We don't have to take it seriously. Blah, blah, blah. That's what a lot of people in analytic philosophy departments, for example, do. And the problem is that they're not grappling with the real philosophical issues. And actually what they're doing inadvertently is amplifying the very postmodernism they're trying to disrupt. And the only way that people who still consider themselves within postmodernism, and there is an older generation of academics who still situate themselves in one way or another, basically within that horizon, the only way that they can still gain cred as like rebels is because there's some other people trying to laugh them out of the room, even though those postmodernist academics are the dominant folks in a whole range of academic disciplines. So, so it's, and there's a generational shift happening, I think, as part of it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's move the critique forward, as it were, or this program forward. And so having sort of laid out this, anarchist cookbook of deconstruction, then you get to kind of you do get to a reconstructive move here. You look beyond just, okay, yeah, we can do the reconstructive or the deconstructive thing, but ultimately you shift to a process ontology and see a lot of promise there for being able to get out of this sort of legitimization crisis that we've been experiencing. By the way, actually, I should also note, so I got my BA in religious studies as an undergraduate, and most of the conversations that we would have, let's say, especially in like a class called Interpretation of Religion, was just literally thinking and talking about how we didn't have an object of study for our entire department. It was all about, what is religion? No one knows. Read this person. But like at the end of the day, no one can tell you, what are we actually doing here? What are we studying? And there was it was kind of ironic to be part of a department that was wrestling with the very object of its study and seeming to be united by the shared realization or affirmation that religion itself didn't seem to exist in the religion department. But anyway, that being said, kind of the way out of that impasse, at least in some ways that you describe in the book, is by turning to a process ontology and by trying to avoid the reification that happens of these sort of concepts as objects, and instead think of them more as processes. And you lay out a way of thinking about that. So talk a little bit about that. How do you think we should be engaging with, now that the objects and the concepts have sort of been thoroughly deconstructed, what is the way forward, the reconstructive move in terms of being able to talk about and explore these inquiries and these lines of thinking?
Yeah, so part of what I observe is that a lot of the things that seem like problems, that seem like impasses or reasons even to destruct the objects of our knowledge, turn out to make perfectly normal sense if you realize what we're actually dealing with is processes, not objects. So even that very metaphor of object versus, a whole bunch of other metaphors that we might use to talk about the social world, it turns out that we can look at the social in terms of processes. It actually explains a bunch of things that look like problems before. And not only that, but it gives us new openings and new techniques. And to do that, I argue for what I call process social ontology. A lot of people are using this word ontology now. It's kind of a buzzword, but they're using it often in contradictory ways. Some people are using ontology to describe, I don't know, like a worldview of a group of people, and other people are using ontology in its older sense to describe, what exists. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is, what is it that causes the social kinds that we experience in our world to exist? What is their foundation of being? This sounds sort of abstract, but like, what is it that makes a particular piece of paper money, for instance? Like, what is it that makes a social kind a social kind? What gives it that entrance into that category of money? And insofar as that there was a theorizing about this, a lot of that theorizing has tended to do with these like vast, either there's like you get in economic departments and certain kinds of sociology, a kind of rational choice individualism theory, kind of methodological or ontological individualism, which is like it's just people and the things that they say or something like that. Or in an older stratum of sociological theorizing, there was this idea that there were vast organic wholes called society or culture that had certain kinds of functional features to them. Neither of those, I think, turns out to make much sense. And I think instead, what we need to recognize is that things like dollar bills get their socialness as part of their ontological grounding, as a result of a certain kind of processes, a set of processes. And I mean processes in not a metaphorical sense, but in a very literal sense. And in this respect, I mean, I'm obviously reading, I know that there's a lot of process ontology at this exact moment, and I'm reading folks like Whitehead, but it's not specifically a Whiteheadian view. I think what some people get out of Whiteheadian process ontologies is a kind of flux where everything is indeterminate, and or just process is metaphor. So you get, Bill Connolly, who, writes quite movingly in political theory about process theory, but he basically just means it's just a metaphor or something like that. So that's not what I mean, actually. I'm talking even more concretely. We have in both Whitehead and in Marx a critique of reification, which is an artificial thingification of our object, of things in the social world or whatever. And you have a similar observation that comes out of developmental psychology, where people note that humans tend to treat social categories as if they're quote unquote natural kinds. We have a tendency to treat certain things like religions or categories like race or gender or whatever as if they're fixed things with coherent boundaries to them, that they tend to be stable across time, etc. And what people tend to not notice is the way that temporality itself kind of and heterogeneity affect the things that we're talking about. So, categories, in contemporary American politics, for instance, things have shifted. So abortion, for instance, used to be most Protestants were fine with abortion and most Catholics were not. It used to be critiques of abortion used to be a Catholic issue, not a Protestant issue. And then, but in the United States, it's hugely become overwhelmingly, some Catholics still, but mostly a Protestant issue, particularly an evangelical Protestant issue, etc. And so you can see how but if you tell most contemporary evangelicals today, this didn't used to be a Protestant issue, where did this come from? They would be shocked. They wouldn't not only know that history, but they would think that the property of being an evangelical Protestant in our current moment was much more similar now compared to what it was in the past, et cetera, et cetera. So concretely, what I end up doing is arguing that if we think about social kinds, we can argue that I'm going to look at my list here. Wait, okay. We can produce a list of generalizations about their qualities or sort of lack thereof. People have often argued against essentialism in various academic disciplines, and it depends on how you define the term essence, but often, at the very least, the kinds of things that we're interested in, our social kinds, tend to have significant variation, both sort of regional and temporal in their meaning and our properties. So this is what I call high entropic categories. But what I basically mean is that, things like categories like art tend to be messy in a particular way. Mm-hmm. That's feature one of these social kinds. Feature two is that I argue that they're kind of undefinable, that definitions don't really work. Humans don't think in terms of definitions. Our social categories are not definable typically by necessary and sufficient conditions. I argue that they tend to be interdependent. I borrow a term from Sanskrit, Buddhist and Hindu philosophy, specifically Buddhist philosophy, nishvabhava, which means a kind of interdependence. So it's the way that changing the meaning of one social kind tends to change adjacent social kinds. Social kinds tend not to have values on their own, but values as part of a position. I argue that social kinds cross-cut. So rather than arguing, is this art or is this politics, something can be both art and politics, or art and politics at different times. So the same, I don't know, poster or something, for instance, could be a poster of Barack Obama, could be political when it's out on the street, but it could be an art poster when it's in the museum, and that's not incompatible. I tend to argue against this artificial, they tend to be artificially abstracted or reified. There's a tendency of humans to treat these social kinds as if they were objects or entities with discrete boundaries. There's another way, and I also argue that they tend to be historically or culturally contingent. This is another way of talking about their high entropic nature. I'm at number 6 out of 8. Don't worry, I'll stop in a minute. They tend to be normative. The kinds that we create tend to have normative registers. They suggest values. The normativity seems to be inherent in the categories that we and other social beings produce. But and then finally, mind dependence. And then I theorize mind dependence. We sort of skipped the first chapter of my book, but I spend a bunch of time theorizing what mind dependence might look like. And then I argue that social kinds are in certain ways mind dependent, which doesn't mean that they're just in people's heads, but rather there are different ways that they're produced by sentient beings, creatures that have minds. And so if all that is to say, if you grant this, you can see the social world as a continual unfolding process and or a set of intersecting or intercutting processes. And this becomes a processual ontology. It tells you about dollar bills and how they work and how they come together. And it tells us that and this sort of processual nature of our subject matter in the humanities and social sciences has been observed by other people, often in piecemeal ways, but that's often, again, supposed to be one of the things that precludes study of it. So, people like Charles Taylor have been like, the fact that social kinds change a lot, he doesn't use the word social kinds, but anyway, the society changes a lot is why you can't study it properly or scientifically. And that turns out not to be the case. You can study changing things retroactively, even if you can't predict where they're going to go, for instance. So I can tell you all the changes that have gone into the building up of the category, theory, even if I can't tell you where the category theory is going to go or whatever.
Well, let's zoom in on that for a second, because that's fascinating. Yeah. So I finally got to my kind of deeper dive into Hegel, and he says at one point, he's talking about spirit, of course, but he's like, basically spirit can only be understood by means of the various stages through which it passes, and in order to understand it in kind of any complete sense, you need to appreciate its whole developmental unfolding, and because that in some ways is kind of what it is. And I feel like there's a way that we could do something similar, right? That you can acknowledge the discontinuities, but by appreciating the evolutionary flux, the kind of dynamic unfolding of things, you can appreciate what it is by appreciating where it's been and by marking the trajectory. You note, I think, very astutely, that Kuhn in the structure of scientific revolutions basically is like, well, oxygen used to be theorized by this notion of phlogiston. I forget, I don't know how to pronounce it. And this is clearly a discontinuity in theory, but by the very fact that he's making that comparison shows that actually we are able to compare categories across, discontinuous paradigms, basically, and sort of undoes his own argument in the process of it. But is there something like that you're arguing for, that in a sense that by appreciating the full kind of developmental unfolding of things, we can get a sense of what they are in a way, or is that not a good way of framing what you're getting at?
The things I like about it, things I don't, and I'll say what I'll kind of restate it in slightly different terms. So in the first instance, one of the big shifts in the book is I'm presuming discontinuity, heterogeneity, and rupture. So it turns out like rupture and discontinuity is all over the place. So the thing to be explained, a lot of theorists in the past have tried to explain rupture. Like most of Foucault's project is an attempt to, for instance, explain ruptures. Why does the concept of madness change from period 1 to period 2 to period 3 to period 4? If we presume rupture, then the thing to explain is why there's any continuity at all. Why is there any homogeneity? So we presume difference and change over time. The thing to be explained then is homogeneity and stability. And those problems, that's later in the book, I talk about anchoring processes, which is how I describe the different ways that things can have their properties stabilize across time. So in that respect, you kind of turn genealogy on its head. So that's one point. But I think, and then the second thing that I think I agree with about what you're saying, is that there's a way in which what these categories are is their historical unfolding in time. So, what it means to be called art today is to partake in a particular contingent history that have gone through particular, changes, et cetera, et cetera. I tend not to think. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to grasp, unlike Hegel, I don't think that you need to grasp the whole totality of a particular social kind in order to do work with it. In a way, we can overly fetishize, for instance, beginnings. So there's a tendency at our current moment to be like, oh, if you trace the etymology of the word, I don't know, bureau back to its beginning, and then you discover something fundamentally about, offices or something, and it's just like, maybe, but maybe not. Often the more proximate history is what's bearing on the present moment. So I don't want to deny the impact of history on the present, but not all that history is necessarily relevant. And especially because there's a tendency to fetishize origins. And, there are a lot of reasons in this culture why we think, if you want to look at how, whether originalism, like there are a lot of movements that are all about fetishizing origins.
The whole naturalistic fallacy basically coming in.
Yeah, it's a fallacy. Right, exactly. Yeah. And so we don't want to do that. But what we do want to do is note that that a lot of our categories are historically contingent, and that they have been worked out over a particular temporal and cultural horizon. Yeah.
I wanted to zoom in on a couple things there. One is, so to bring like an example here into the mix. So like art is a good one, I think. When you consider, as you mentioned at the outset or earlier on in our conversation about this notion of fine art and why that kind of congeals into a particular constellation in Europe at a particular time, et cetera. I think that in some ways, I guess what I'm trying to suggest is that there's a move that would say, oh, okay, well, let's go to a museum and we'll look at this medieval tapestry, and we say, what a beautiful work of art. And then sort of your deconstructionist move will be, someone will pop out and be like, well, actually, who's to say it's art? Because at the time that it was created, art didn't exist as a category, and this was actually a religious object because it depicts, Christ and the Transfiguration or something. And so actually calling it art isn't really, it's a misnomer, et cetera, et cetera. And then sort of the kind of immediate reaction to that will be, oh, I guess I don't really know what to make of this thing, and I recognize that it's sort of multiple things at once, and maybe it's nothing, and I don't really even know. And what I'm trying to suggest is maybe like we can get a better sense of what it is by appreciating that it is now in this moment being appreciated as art in this particular gallery context. But when it was produced, that those particular historical contextual contingencies didn't exist, and so it was conceptualized differently. But then we can appreciate what it is even at the present moment better by appreciating the various discontinuities that it's passed through to end up here, while also simultaneously appreciating that in the future other categories could emerge that we don't have yet any understanding of, and basically what it will be is even subject to both reinterpretation and kind of retrospective revision, et cetera, et cetera. So this all becomes messy, but rather than sort of give up on the whole epistemological enterprise, we basically take that into the enterprise and say, to know a thing is to appreciate what it has been and what it might be. That's kind of what I was sort of.
I agree with you there. And then, we could add as you were, where you were going, which is this Walter Benjamin-ish point that then for the work to live on, to have an afterlife, it means that it has to be available to be reinterpreted and transformed in new ways. So, the painting, to the extent to which it no longer fits into new categories, will tend to no longer be functionally interesting or relevant to a particular group of folk. It'll fade from view. It won't have that afterlife. But yeah, I totally agree with that. And then part of the question is, what are you doing with your particular culture categories? Like when you're saying this medieval painting is art, what do you take yourself to be saying? And one of the arguments in the book is that we're often talking past each other when we're making those kind of statements, because we presume categories that are more homogenous and less temporally unstable than they actually are. And so we have a tendency to do, if we're not careful, anachronistic back projection, and or presume that you and I are using the word art in the same way because we're both native English speakers, but actually we may have different ideas of what art is, et cetera, et cetera. So and then they're partially also to make a disconnect between the thing being referred to and the inferences built into that particular referential or interpretive act itself. So you can get more out of a work of painting than the person who made it put into it. There's one of the things you might be trying to reconstruct is, what did that painter have in mind? But something else you might be trying to reconstruct is, I don't know, you're trying to infer something about the medieval world or how it is looks next to the Mona Lisa or whatever. I mean, there's a whole range of things that you can interpret or find. And so anyway, so that's part of also what I try and argue for in the book. Yeah.
Also, I realized I misspoke. I said the naturalistic fallacy. I meant the genetic fallacy. The notion that something where something comes from determines what it is. And it's an interesting side note, probably be too long of a tangent to pursue, but like I wonder if there are particular areas or fields or contexts in which the genetic fallacy actually isn't a fallacy, but really does have bearing on the ontological reality of a thing. For example, like I wrote a monograph that largely looked at the evolution of the Satan concept, right? And so if you're, say, like an evangelical and you believe, well, Satan is Satan, Satan's always been the case, and then you're presented with information that like, oh, actually I can watch how the very idea of Satan evolved throughout the whole kind of religious literature, and appreciate that this kind of idea wasn't at the beginning and sort of is at this end, then it does create a question of like, well, if it was generated over a long time span and it's contingent upon the history that evolved it, is it actually a thing? But trying to deal with these issues in like a devotional context would probably become very too complicated, I would think, if we're going to go there, because I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, where I would go is also to say that there's been a presumption in lots of this literature that if you can show that something changed over time or has these discontinuities built into its history, then it isn't a thing or that it doesn't exist. And one of the big things I'm arguing against in the book is that presupposition. What it means for a social kind to exist, that's why I call it like a social ontology, is to undergo those kind of changes over time. So we totally shouldn't be surprised that things have changed over time. And then when you're asking, is there a way to do words, the history is sometimes relevant to the present moment. And I think, I'm not saying that it sometimes the origins are relevant to the present moment and sometimes they're not. There's a difference between, on a case-by-case category basis, like our, usage of the word hors d'oeuvres may have very little to do with the original French meaning of the term and everything to do with the present moment, but it could turn out that our usage of the term genetics has everything to do with the particular moment when that term was coined. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if that's true of the word genetics, but I'm pretending. But I definitely do think that pasts do impinge on the present and on our categories, but you have to be able to provide a story, to provide an analysis or kind of evidence for how the past is impinging on the present rather than presuming it.
Sure.
So the biggest thing is we don't assume that just because it was X in the origins, it is X in the present. Like if you were to discover, for instance, that all that early American English departments were racist, I imagine they were. Does that mean English departments today are racist? It doesn't tell you either way. It could be the case that all contemporary American English departments are racist, but there's an extra step of proof that would need to show how that early property carried over to the present, if you're going to make that claim.
Right. Yeah.
So it just depends also on what kind of properties you're trying to attribute to something in a particular moment.
Yeah. It raises an interesting question, which I won't dig in too much, but there's a lot of question around the words that we use and how using them can reify certain racist or oppressive concepts, etc. And I think the discussion that we're having bears on that broader conversation as well. I mean, is it inherently problematic if I say, oh, well, a rule of thumb would be, and then if someone comes along and says, well, don't you know where that came from? You're reifying this, blah, 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 blah. It's like, well, did any of this have this current resonance with you when I said that? And anyway, the way that words and phrases change and the kind of historical legacies that they have, et cetera, is part of the I think what people assume to also be associated with a kind of the postmodern paradigm in terms of some of the ideas that it puts forward to try to critique and break down and deconstruct oppressive systems by interrogating our language use. But I think some of what we're talking about right now would be a really healthy set of ideas to bring to some of those conversations to kind of unpack some of that deconstructionist paradigm in some way. But I don't want to linger there. And anyway, it's not really particularly important. But I want to move on a little bit. And so basically, it seems like kind of what you've done or are doing, this metamodern philosophical program that you're articulating, is naming these deconstructionist strategies, appreciating kind of what they all have in common, to be able to understand then this theory of concepts that we've been working with, that's sort of both imperfect, as these deconstructionist strategies have recognized, but at the same time then moving into a process ontology where we can appreciate, we can actually regain something of, if not the objects of study, at least the processes of study that would be the basis for various forms of various academic disciplines and that sort of thing, to be the focus of our interest in our study. And again, to the extent that a lot of postmodernism has been rather concerned, even obsessed with this notion of deconstructing our social kinds and our academic fields and our disciplines, this is itself a kind of huge step forward beyond that, by means of the very deconstructive process. But I want to move into this next thing, and I can kind of anticipate we're probably not going to have too much time to fully unpack everything here, or certainly not the rest of the book. But the next thing that you get into is something you called hylosemiotics, and because what we've been talking about is not just concepts and objects, but in some ways has a lot of bearing on our whole kind of theory of knowledge itself. And, is knowledge possible? Again, a lot of postmodernism is equated with a sort of anti-realism, anti-essentialism, and a deep skepticism that knowledge of anything is possible. And so sort of in response to that, flank or that sort of prong, I guess you could say, of the postmodern paradigm, you articulate this particular paradigm of hylosemiotics. So speak a little bit about this, and then I want to, go ahead and speak a little bit about this, and then I think that there are interesting ways that this all connects to various things that have come up in our conversation.
Sure. So to take a step back for people who haven't had a chance to read this book, or who might not do so, it's a systematic philosophy. So there are a lot of things that turn out to be related to each other. And one of the moves that I'm trying to do in the book is to note that one of the side effects of disciplinary silos is that we often do crappy, redundant work with other people, or we, think that we rediscover the wheel over and over and over again, or we miscommunicate with people across other disciplines, or we produce new kinds of problems because of the way that specialization treats as unconnected things that turn out to be fundamentally connected. For instance, the relationship between language and the world, for instance, which is part of where the hylosemiotic stuff comes from. So one of the things is an attempt to argue against silos, and an attempt to argue, but also to make a kind of systematic argument, a systematic philosophy, which is totally weird. People aren't really doing it now. That's why, Hegel is relevant, because he's a massive systematic philosopher. Me, I'm trying to do it in a small number of pages that I have to condense like crazy or whatever. But, otherwise I could have written, a series of books, but unfortunately for space reasons, I had to suck it down. And also because I wanted to show how all the pieces fit together. And one of the things that's clear, so there are 5 areas that I'm making interventions. And one of these is a kind of new philosophy of social science, the process social ontology stuff, which is about concepts and social categories and how social construction works. But related to that is a question of meaning. So it would be hugely remiss to attempt to argue about how the social world is put together and to ignore language, right? Like, it would seem like that shit is super important. So, and it turned out that then we have an inherited philosophy of language, often associated with postmodernism, although sometimes it floats by under the banner of post-structuralism, that wasn't very good. And not to say that everybody inherited it. Those in Anglo-American philosophy departments inherited something else that was equally messy often, at least, one of the main dominant threads in philosophy of language, which is language as reference theory, associated with Putnam and Kripke and others, that also I wanted to argue against for reasons I won't bore your listeners about. But basically, in a lot of academic disciplines, we've inherited a kind of bad philosophy of language. The philosophy of language we inherited loosely from people like Ferdinand de Saussure is related to the idea that that language is in a certain respect arbitrary, that meaning of things is determined by their position in a semantic structure, their relationship to other adjacent concepts. So famously, the meaning of the word mutton is based not on some central core definition of mutton, but how it is distinguished from categories like pork, in categories like lamb or whatever, so it's what's called differential theory of meaning. It also Saussure bracketed out the world. So meaning isn't about world, it's about a relationship between a sound and a mental concept. So a sign and a mental concept. So that could be a sound or a letter or whatever in a mental concept. Then and one of the central dogmas of Saussure linguistics is the arbitrariness of the sign. So there's no essential connection between a sound and a mental concept. Well, this philosophy of language led toward a lot of really weird conclusions. So what people like Derrida and company have talked about, which I treat as a reductio absurdum, but is often taken to be true about language in general, which is the idea that linguistic meaning is, the translation is impossible, that the sign is arbitrary, that meaning is, you can't stabilize meaning because meaning is always deferred. Derrida has this term différence, which just is pronounced difference, but is spelled differently. There's a pun that he's playing with. It's very French that way, but meaning is constantly deferred. You'd have to know the meaning of a whole system or structure in order to know the meaning of a single word, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All this stuff is often taken to show that, translation is impossible, that and then it was added to a broader philosophy of language associated with people like Benjamin Whorf and Edward Sapir, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is, crudely paraphrased, the idea, linguistic determinism, the idea that language determines thought. We're trapped in a famous metaphor by Fred Jameson. He claims is Nietzsche, but he's mistranslating or misreading Nietzsche. But anyway, they're trapped in a prison house of language. And so this view, if we think we're trapped in a prison house of language, we think communication is impossible, the translation is impossible, that the sign, blah, 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 it leads to all these weird paradoxes. And it turns out to be a very inaccurate way to describe how communication works and functions. What paradoxes does it lead to? Well, I'll give you just, one example that I spend a bunch of time on in the book. So a lot of people who read this literature think that translation is impossible. When I tell that non-academics, that people think that, that I was taught by one of my advisors that translation is impossible, they're like, what? And then if I tell you, and I was taught that translation was impossible by reading a work of Derrida's translated from French, they're like, huh? And then if you look at or if you look at, so it turns out that almost all the works that argue for the impossibility of translation make their case by translating something and telling you how it cannot be translated. This is true of Benjamin's, famous Brot and Wein, where he says, you can't translate the Wein and Brot are not mutually interchangeable between German and French, but then he tells you what they mean in German and French. Or, when Whorf describes how Native American, I think he's talking about Navajo languages, are not translatable into standard European languages, he then tells you what you're missing. Okay. These are translations. And so it turns out that you're in fact only able to make the argument for the impossibility of translation by doing the very thing it says is impossible. And so that paradox is a clue that whole philosophy of language is a mess. And if you really thought we were imprisoned in language and couldn't get to the world outside, it makes certain things like reference impossible. I couldn't be able to tell you, this tea or whatever, because that would be describing relationship between language and the world, which these very theories often want to push out of existence. And the other thing that these theories are incapable of doing is making a case for how language evolved. And so what it ends up arguing is for something, you get this in Heidegger, language or the search for meaning or hermeneutics becomes a kind of new fallenness, which is a particularity of humans, that we're trapped in the world of mediation because it's a semiotically mediated world, and we can never reach or understand the world around us. And then you get the idea that animals must not live like that, and it's very anthropocentric. And I don't just mean anthropocentric because you could add an ism on the end of anything and make it sound bad. I mean, it's just humans evolved, and we evolved and our nearest relatives, chimpanzees, communicate with each other. So how could that have happened? How could we be the only ones trapped in a kind of mediated, fabulous world? And so for all those reasons, and for a host of others, I argue that the inherited philosophy of language in many academic disciplines is no good. And then hylosemiotics is my alternative. And I see that we have 10 minutes or 15 minutes left, but I don't know if I can stage it in the gap. But I'll say, I'll just say that turns out to be profoundly unsatisfactory. And part of the reason that it has gone on as long as it has is because people were bracketing the world out.
Yeah. Well, I want to throw out my interpretation of what you're saying, and then see if this is a good way of thinking about it. Because I think you did just right now a very good job unfolding a lot of the critiques with this whole linguistic paradigm that has led to a lot of solipsism and this sort of paradoxical, aporia and that sort of thing. But so it's actually interesting. There's someone you don't name explicitly. At least I don't think. I didn't check the endnotes about this particular section, so maybe he's in the endnotes. But Piaget, I don't know if you name him at all, but he has this whole theory of genetic epistemology, right? And so like basically knowledge springs not from abstract concepts, but through manipulation of the world, and that we basically abstract from our manipulation of objects. And that's how we then kind of come to abstract concepts and language and things like that. And it seemed like you were saying something very similar in the sense of, well, I'll just quote you. Nothing like quoting the author to the author. You say knowledge emerges from the exploratory manipulation of the physical world. And there is a very interesting thing where, and again, I want to posit this, and we could talk about this, you and I, in a broader context, or at least I want to throw this out for the audience. But like in the sense of the attractor that I mentioned at the outset, even though you don't name Piaget explicitly here, there are fascinating parallels and kind of interweaving relationships with other elements that are very crucial to various other forms of the metamodern discourse along the lines of developmental psychology, which you brought up a minute ago in terms of the tendency to reify, that there's sort of this tendency that we have, that developmental psychology does reveal, that we tend to objectify things, reify them, concretize them in a false way, and that leads to all sorts of philosophical problems. And I think that the value of developmental psychology and a Piagetian sort of genetic epistemology all seems to dovetail very well with a lot of the arguments that you're making in this book. I just wanted to make that point. But to the point about hylosemiotics, it seems like what you're saying is that, and you're drawing on sort of a Charles Sanders Peircean kind of semiotic paradigm here, is that it's not just the sign and the signified as sort of this individual has concepts and words or concepts and signs that relate, but also that they are in an environment, that it's an agent arena relationship, and that we've lost that element of the kind of theory hitherto, at least in a postmodern context. And so it seems like what you're doing is sort of putting back into this conversation the environment, to the relationship of individual to the world, and how our words and our concepts and our language and our communication relate individuals to the world and to each other in this sort of agent arena relationship. And that seems to be, once you have that reinstalled into the conversation, then you aren't untethered in this solipsistic world of ideas and in this kind of fallen state. You actually are relating to things, and they do have meaning, and they do have an influence on the way that people operate in the world. There's a whole theory too about information and semantics in sort of a thermodynamic context as it relates to the continuation of individual organisms needing to gather information from their environment in order to sustain themselves. That actually, I think, is also highly adjacent to the point that you're trying to make. But I should have probably... So these are things that came up for me while I was reading your argument that all seemed rather adjacent, which I seem to be describing what I think you're saying in a sort of negative space in relationship to these other ideas. But in short, in brief, it seemed like what you were saying to me was that we left out the way that our signs relate to the world, and we need to appreciate that our knowledge comes from our interaction, our mutual relatedness to the world and our environment. And if we do that, then we can kind of get meaning. Meaning is meaningful again. Is something like that what you're getting
sort of like that? Yeah. So what I want to do is make a very Kantian move. Like what I'm trying to do is a sort of transcendental deduction, if I can be forgiven for comparing myself to Kant in any way. But what I want to say is that it isn't the case that we have to have a particular ontology of how the physical world works. So in the social sphere, I have a very concrete social ontology, but in the language chapter, I provide what I call a meta-ontology, which is to say there just have to be some limits on the world. There has to be a world. It doesn't have to be the world exactly as described by contemporary physics. It doesn't have to, it could be the world, described by, indigenous Nahuatl speakers. It could be the world described by Jehovah's Witnesses. It could be the world described, it doesn't matter. All that you need is there to be a world that has roughly stable property clusters is my preferred phrasing for it, but basically, or you could use a Buddhist Sanskrit vocabulary, skandhas, which is to say aggregates. It's got to be clumpy. There has to be stuff that's somewhat clumpy, and it has to be crudely stable. Like it can't be changing so quickly that we can't perceive it or talk about it. Otherwise, there'd be literally nothing for us to hold on to. We wouldn't be able to, eat food, or, if my furniture was constantly turning into sheep or something, it would be hard to talk. Okay. So, but if you grant even this little bit, even a meta-ontology, if you even just say, there just has to be a world. I'm not even going to tell you what the world looks like. There just has to be a world. It has to have at least a very, very minimal features to it. Then that lets you formulate a new philosophy of language without the bracketing move of Saussure. And also, just as a parenthetical, it allows me to reject what I see as some of the problems of the Kripke-Putnam model, which thinks that a central feature of language is reference to natural kinds, which are a certain set of scientific categories. But it turns out if you actually study them, the natural kinds are a mess, and then you can't figure out what reference is referencing to. Because this lets me absorb some of the critique, which is to say, we can note that we're often not talking about the same things. Reference is part of what we're doing, but we don't, language is less about cutting up the world. It's more about pointing at clusters of properties. And so I'm saying, that mountain over there, do you have the same sense of where that mountain ends and where it begins as I do? Probably not, but we probably crudely have within a couple miles a sense of the boundaries of the mountain, because we can see the, similar kind of cluster. Is your subjective sense of blue the same as mine? I don't know. It doesn't necessarily matter. Are our color categories the same? They probably overlap, but they're probably not identical. All that is to say, communication turns out to be way more lossy or way more, messy and fraught than is often taken by certain analytic philosophers to be the case. And there's no point in aiming for a precision that doesn't map a world that isn't in itself full of these heaps, these sorites. Right. So, it would be a mistake to be overly precise about a category that in and of itself doesn't have clear boundaries. So, for example, what are called sorites paradoxes, how many hairs does it take to have a bald man or something? The world is full of these boundary issues. And it turns out that with a vague world, it turns out that vague language is probably actually an advantage. The downside is that the best we can do is kind of overlap. And so, in part, if you make this move, if you just grant that there is a world and that language has a relationship to that world, then what you can also, and you don't privilege any particular ontology of the physical world, you can then begin to make some basic deductions about the way that language could function and must function, and not just for humans, but any other kind of sentient being. Yeah. And what it does is it pushes language much closer to perception than most language theorists want to theorize language. We can't make the basic Cartesian solipsist move where we just say, imagine that we're homunculi sitting in our heads thinking outward, and that there might or might not be a world out there or whatever. That move turns out to be a dead end. But we also don't have to think that the world is as we perceive it. You can be a neo-Kantian, you could be a whole range of different kinds of philosophies out there. We just have to be able to roughly coordinate reference. And if that's the case, then a lot of other problems start to fall away. And then, because we're not going to have time to go into this, but I then step out, work out from there, drawing on figures like Peirce, drawing on a famous Baltic German biologist with a very difficult to pronounce name, Jakob von Uexküll, and a host of other theorists in a range of disciplines. And I start to begin to think about what that might tell us, not just about how humans interpret our semantically rich, our sign environment, but also how other kinds of sentient beings, in other words, other kinds of sign producers and consumers might interpret their environment as well. My term for this is, sentient beings, basically, but I don't have a hard line for, what counts as but anyway, but at least things like plants and animals seem to consume our environment in semiotically rich ways. And because of that, it opens up to a different kind of philosophy of language, which is what I call hylosemiotics. Hylo taking this word that meant both matter and forest in the original Greek, and then semiotics, signs. We start to see that linguistic signs, words or written texts, are just one aspect of an environment that is rich with sign. Just to give you a little hint at this, we get close to this in English when we say things like, this is an example I use all the time, so forgive me for repeating it, but a dark cloud means rain. that is a statement about meaning. And it turns out there are some people who are writing in the world of what they think of as natural information, and they think that there is an inherent information built into the cloud. That's not where I'm going. I think that there's still an interpreter that needs to be there. So I would say this dark cloud means rain to me. I could be wrong about that if it then doesn't rain, right? But if it does rain, then I'm right that cloud meant rain in this particular context, etc. But that means there's a whole bunch of things start to come out of that. The same cloud can mean different things to different people. For me, looking at the cloud and its darkness, it might mean rain. For a pilot, it might mean turbulent weather or a difficult ascent. For someone who I don't know, knows a lot more about clouds than I do, it might mean a good harvest. I mean, I don't know, right? But meaning then turns out to be about a kind of perception of one's environment. And then the vectors of meaning voluntarily produced signs also turn out to have to be materialized. So the whole reason that we can have this conversation is that I'm making sound waves happen in a particular way, or for those of you who are reading the book, that certain physical textual objects or virtual textual objects are being interpreted for their semiotic value. And then I get into a crazy level of detail about different kinds of signs, how they might work. And then to come back to your point, I haven't read very much Piaget, but I guess this is compatible with what he was saying, how we then come to know that world, at least partially. And I'm not making, again, I'm not denying a Kantian account of Ding an sich. Things may have natures to them that are unavailable to finite beings. I'm not arguing, humans, bats, and earthworms perceive very different things about our environments. We live in different, what Uxco called Umwelt. We live in Umwelten, to give it the plural, but we live in these different kinds of semantically rich worlds that at best overlap, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of other things that come out of this, but a part of it is also an attempt, and I'll end on perhaps on this note, to turn the mind inside out, to start taking more seriously what we can say about perception if we just grant that there's a world. It doesn't have to be a particular way, but we just grant that there's a world that is there to be perceived. And then it turns out that a bunch of the things that we thought of as operations that happened exclusively in our heads turn out to happen through exploratory manipulation of the environment. But then there's a lot of other stuff that is a corollary of this as well.
Well, we're packing a lot in. No, this is great. We're packing a lot into this. And actually, it's funny. I tend to listen to podcasts on like 1.5 times their speed. I don't think people will have to do do that for this one. I think
you may want to slow it down or whatever. Yeah, totally.
There's a lot more we could get into there. And again, there's so many adjacent things that I think are pointing towards something very similar. And so I really appreciated your formulation of these ideas. One of them was this idea of knowledge as inference, which has all these really deep ties with Bayesian inference and all of that kind of thermodynamic information theory I mentioned just a second ago, which I think is totally congruent with what you're talking about here. But then I think this just to appreciate the notion that a lot of our semiotics and our notions of meaning and much else has been sort of predicated on a kind of a false Cartesian dualism of subject object split, when in fact I think what you talk about in terms of turning the subject inside out is about relating the subject to the world as being appreciating that we in some senses are first and foremost the world, in a sense relating to itself, which would be my language, at least one of the ways you put this, or at least I'm reading you as saying something similar, is you say, rather than conceiving of epistemology in terms of an isolated thinker coming to know the universe, we might instead think of the universe coming to know us. And a few sentences before, to a sentient being, to be a sentient being is to be interwoven with an environment. We are all part of a cosmos that attempts to know itself, which is very akin to a lot of the stuff that I'm very fascinated by, and some of the actual grand narrative or meta-narratological thinking that I think is also part of this meta-modern space. But time precludes a deeper exploration of some of that. I really appreciate this. This was great. I love people. Yeah, me too. I love giving people an opportunity to get a sense of what some of this book covers. Would love to maybe do a follow-up conversation where we could get into the end of the book. But anyway, for now, thank you so much, Jason. Really appreciate it. And everyone go check out this book and appreciate its great wisdom and depth. But thank you so much also for coming on the podcast. Appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. And let's definitely do a follow-up. I'd be happy to do that. Yeah.
Cool. Sounds good. All right. Take care.
All right. Take care.